There are some books that sneak up on you. You crack them open expecting a history of beer, and before you know it, you're traveling across continents, tracing the rise of capitalism, migration, labor, empire, masculinity, advertising, and globalization, all through a pint glass. And that's exactly what happened when I picked up Hopped Up: How Travel, Trade, and Taste Made Beer a Global Commodity by food historian Jeffrey Pilcher. What starts as a history of beer becomes something much bigger, a story about people, about why we gather, why we drink, why certain flavors become symbols of class, nation, or identity, and how something as simple as a cold lager can connect medieval Bavaria, industrial capitalism, the Civil War, Prague beer halls, and your local Colorado brewery. And honestly, this one was just fun. We talked about Minnesota memories, Czech beer culture, sour beers, bourbon barrel stouts, why IPAs are overrated, the strange genius of Corona advertising, and the deep human need to sit around a table together after a long day and share a drink. So pour yourself something cold: beer, wine, bourbon, hell, have yourself a Coca Cola, whatever makes you happy, and settle in. This is a terrific conversation with Jeffrey Pilcher about beer, history, and the strange ways human beings have always tried to find meaning, community, and maybe just a little joy in a glass. I'm Jason Herbert, and this is A Reckoning. My name is Jason Herbert. I'm a Southerner who lives in the West. I'm a historian, an outdoorsman, and a movie buff. I like finding new answers to old questions, and this is A Reckoning. You and I have been crossing circles, apparently, for a little while. When we first started talking, I didn't know that you'd had the University of Minnesota experience. I apparently just missed you. I arrived in 2015.
Yeah, no, I left in 14.
That is crazy. That is a crazy, crazy coincidence. I'm going to try not to take that personally. You maybe heard that there was this guy coming and just did Seminole history.
No. So did you work with David, or who did you work with?
Yeah, David was my advisor. So, and I wrote my dissertation on Seminoles and the introduction of cattle into indigenous Florida and all that. So, and generally pestered David for for a few years until he finally said, "Okay, you're done. Go on. You're a grown up historian now." So, but I had amazing faculty over at Minnesota, and it's a weird thing when you go to where it is you're going to get your PhD, because you have no idea before you apply there that this city is going to be a place that you're going to be tied to for the rest of your life. And since I've graduated, gone back for weddings and things like that of graduate school colleagues and things like that. I'm taking my girlfriend there later this year to go back to Minnesota State Fair, of course, which is like a rite of passage,
So I'm a food historian. I never did that.
Are you kidding? Wow. It is something else. Listen, I used to work at Walt Disney World, and I found that the Minnesota State Fair is overwhelming. It is a lot, but a lot of fun. And that whole Como area over. Did you ever go to the Como Observatory when you were there? Yeah. Are you familiar with this? It's just lovely.
You know what? Isn't that like? I think that Steve Ruggles lived just down the hill from there. Yeah. So I've been in the neighborhood, but I have never actually been to.
I think I went to Steve's house during recruitment. Is what I did, and so forth. But yeah, and it was great. It's a little, for me, it's like when I was in grad school, and I don't know about your experience, but I always had to find these little outlets to get away from the reading, the pressure, the whatever, right? The self-doubt, all these things. So I'd go and talk to the gorillas for 6 hours at a time over there. That was a thing. So, but you've got Kansas connections too. You're referencing this in the book. Where's the Kansas family?
So the town is Leon. It's near El Dorado, Augusta, sort of east of Wichita. I guess it's a big city if you are looking for something.
I hold 2 degrees from Wichita State University. So Yeah, my bachelor's and master's both came from Wichita State.
Okay.
So yeah, when you're talking about Kansas, it's like I know these places that
Yeah.
you've been frequenting and
Yeah,
so
so
forth.
actually, the people who the beer drinkers I referenced there were went to Kansas State,
Yep.
but not Wichita State. But yeah,
Let's just jump into it, Jeffrey, because there's a lot to cover here, a lot more than I was expecting. I didn't expect I was going to go globetrotting when I first cracked open your book, and that is very much what happened. And I didn't expect to go so far. I was sending pictures of the text to my best friends who were both Egyptologists. And I was like, look at this. And like, where's this? I was like, so they're getting copies soon enough of your book. But do you want to introduce yourself and tell us like who you are and what you do?
hello, my name is Jeffrey Pilcher. I'm a professor of food studies at the University of Toronto, and I've written a book called Hopped Up: How Travel, Trade, and Taste Made Beer a Global Commodity. And that's me in a nutshell.
Listen, if the title alone doesn't sell books, because when I was cruising through Oxford's website and I was talking to a few friends over at the of the press, I just saw your book. It's like I need this. I need this now. I need to talk about this.
Actually, Oxford is kind of the beer drinkers' press. I mean, not all the beer books are at Oxford, but a lot of them are. So I don't know why that is.
It feels bad. I messaged you last night. I finished your book actually drinking a glass of Malbec. So I was like, am I cheating here? And I felt like I should be, having a longboard or something like that. But I figured you wouldn't mind too much.
No, I do not object. I do not object. I am Catholic, the sort of big tent or big
Okay,
bowl.
fair enough.
You can drink out of anything. You drink anything you want.
All right, well, fair enough. Well, before we jump into this, I have to ask you, beer of choice, Jeffrey. This is the thing I need to know about you right off the bat. What are you drinking?
Well, all right.
What's your option?
So, I mean, I grew up drinking the same pale lager as everybody else. But doing the research for this book really, kind of opened up the world of just how big the world of beer is.
Hmm.
And I have become a big fan of sour beers.
Really?
And yeah, and in fact, Goes, this sort of East German, actually, there's not an East Germany anymore, but is it's a sour beer that's flavored with salt, and it's really quite good. And see, I mean, you get that kind of sourness, but then that saltiness that I don't know,
Hmm.
it's a flavor that. I really like it. It's not everybody's cup of tea. I understand that, but I'll take it anytime.
I'm struggling out here. I live in Colorado now, and everyone out in Colorado it's IPA central out here. It is the home of the IPA, Colorado. And I am not an IPA guy. I can drink it if I'm in the backyard at a barbecue. A friend offers me a drink. Sure, absolutely. I'm not an IPA. I'm a lager guy, Jeffrey. Something simple, easy, smooth. I was just my first night here in Colorado Springs a few nights ago. I ran over to the local Irish pub, had myself a harp. I was completely at ease. I just need something very light and easy. The big heavy stuff, and you talk about Guinness in the book. The big, I'm not ready for a meal when I'm drinking my
Well, and
beer.
that's really the difference between, a pale lager and a stout or even
Hmm.
an IPA or one of these things. And I think that this is a transition that happens in the 19th century, the mid 19th century, which is when pale lagers take off and really become the dominant beer, is that workers who could afford beer had enough to eat already. They did not need to drink their meal. And so there's this, I think, fundamental change in the what beer is. It's characteristic from food, from bread, liquid bread, to entertainment. And so people who are modern young people or not so young people there, they want a beer that they can drink and enjoy. It's kind of the session beer that you can just kind of drink down and not going to knock them out. That's going to not if they're playing sports, it's not going to slow them down. And so it's a fundamental change of what beer meant. And I think that's really one of the reasons why, to this day, 90% or far more probably of the beer that is consumed in this world is that same pale lager.
So I have to ask you then why, you're talking about yourself being a food historian of all the things you could have written about and so forth. Why beer? What attracted you to this in like this moment of time?
Well, I had just finished a book on a global history of tacos. It's called
Mhm.
Planet Taco. And I needed a drink. And what was it going to be? I mean, after you have tacos, you need a beer. And so I just applied that same research methodology, which was to travel around, either eating tacos or drinking beer, and see where it led me. But actually, that's kind of a glib answer, although there's some truth to it. But another reason was, and this really comes out of my teaching, because I had, for a very long time, taught two classes. One of them was a history of food, but the other one was a history of drink. And the two classes were very different in interesting ways. And I've got to tell you that drink class, the number one goal of that class was to get undergraduates to think about what they were drinking. And, having thought back to my own university experience, it's like, you know what? University is a time when you're out of the house, you're outside of parental constraints, but you're not really actually grown up yet. And so a lot of things happen, and things that we all have to grow up sometime. But alcohol, you can get in a lot of trouble, and so just being a little more reflective about what we drink was the goal of that class, and I decided, that this was such an interesting topic that I wanted to write something about it. I wanted to do something historical. And the question was, what was it going to be? And, having come from the history of tacos, you can't do champagne. It doesn't work. I could have done tequila, but the research would have killed me. And so I had to go back and getting to the point in life where, a nice beer actually sounds pretty good.
Yeah, but the cool thing about this book, you go and you go, oh, this could be the history of this thing, but really it becomes this instrument to study how people are relating. This is a labor history. This is a gendered history. This is a history of capitalism and markets and things like that. I mean, and that's the cool thing about history. I think so many people miss out. You can take a thing like beer, right? And we can absolutely study beer and how people enjoy it, and it's and all the cool parts about like how it evolves and blah blah blah. But then building the world around it, and we get to see the shifts around this instrument, this device. It was really, really fascinating. And I guess that maybe brings me to a question, which is, when you're teaching these classes about the history of drink and so forth, or you tell people, hey, I'm writing a book on beer. What are the misconceptions that people have when they come to you? It's like, oh, I've got these thoughts or whatever. Like, what do you hear?
Yeah, I mean, so there's boy, there's a lot of kind um, of thoughts on what that might be, and the history of capitalism, as you said, is probably not at the top of their list, and yet it is such a pervasive part of life and has been for so very long that it really is a history of everything. And I guess, I do actually include kind of a preface where I talk about my own beer drinking, but I didn't want this to be kind of, my memoirs, drunken, that those things are better left. I mean, I know that people today share, but I never really got into that much sharing. And so I wasn't going there, and I wanted it to be history. And in fact, I was talking to a publisher, and I kind of took it as a compliment. I was thinking, trade book or whatever, that this would have a popular audience, and this sounds a little too much like history. And I'm like, well, yeah, okay. And I never did really find out what that person thought, where that person thought the book should go. But I mean, at the end of the day, I did want it to be an academic work. I mean, I wanted it to be, serious scholarship, and there are actually many other books out there that people, if they want that sort of a history of beer, they can. It's there. So yeah.
You know, I'm kind of wondering, maybe we should bring things back down to the basics here, because we're talking about beer, and I think what we got here is like, I think one of the great things the book does is kind of breaks down this idea is like there's a lot of different forms of beer early on, and you really kind of talk about this maze way in which all of these forms of beer are kind of making their way into what we know of as today. So I don't want to take it for granted, Jeffrey, that like we all understand when we talk about beer, what exactly it is. Can we like backtrack a second and be like, okay, what is beer?
Yeah. So one of the astonishing things is that this one particular beer from arguably from one town is now consumed all around the world. And so to sort of, kind of look at the origins, how did that happen? I wanted to say, well, what were people drinking before then? And if you define, if you take the word, it's a European word, beer, but, sort of for what it means, which is a grain based, fermented, relatively low alcohol drink. Okay. And then sort of think about, are there examples of that around the world? I mean, we can think of any number of them, the Chinese and Japanese and East Asians. I mean, they actually did drink barley beer before they drank a rice beer. Just because of the way the technology evolved, and barley, kind of ferments better than any other drink, which is why it is the beer of choice in many places. But you certainly have rice beers like sake is, I guess, the best known of them. In Africa, I mean, they ferment everything. I mean, millet and sorghum are kind of the two basic grains, but I mean, they ferment bananas. They ferment. I mean, you name it, they will ferment it there. And of course, in Mexico, it's pulque. It's made from the agave plant, which is sort of the same thing that they distill to make tequila. But before the distillation was introduced, they fermented it to make a drink called pulque. In South America, they would make a maize beer that was called chicha, and that's just kind of a very simple sample of these things. And I mean, the thing about grains is that they're the most prolific foods that we can produce. And so, if we can, transform them into alcohol, they're the cheapest, right? And so, I mean, if we think of wine as being any fruit that's fermented, and grapes are, the most obvious example, or if we think of mead, which is fermented honey, I mean, those are two kind of expensive drinks, which is why they tended to be lent to the aristocracy. But anybody peasant could raise some grain, and if they had a surplus, they could transform it into a beer. And so, societies have been doing that for a very long time, and it was and really always has been kind of the common person's drink. So, and that too was just kind of fitting with the way that I wanted to do the research. And so, I mean, wine has always been the drink of the aristocracy.
Yeah, I find it absolutely fascinating that those lines continue across cultures and civilizations and generations. And I was thinking about, obviously, I'm a huge wine guy. I absolutely love wine. It's just a joy of mine to be able to sit and drink and taste and so forth. And sounds silly whenever I do my thing and I get yelled at by my girlfriend. She's like, stop smelling your wine. I can't help it. But these ideas, and I think of beer as like this working class thing. You go to the bar, you watch the game with a beer. You don't really watch the game with a glass of wine. I find that fascinating. Is that basically the difference between these two? Say between these two drinks over time is the class difference themselves. And I mean, how does the story of beer kind of compare to the story of wine over time?
Yeah, I mean, I think there really is something about beer that is founded in sociability and in kind of equality, and certainly in modern versions of that. I mean, we can think of the culture of the pub, right?
Hmm.
Which is really about kind of working class solidarity, and these rules is that I mean, kind of when you sit down and it's your turn to buy the round. I mean, you're kind of an obligation to participate in that communal drinking. And we can see that in many other societies that because in actually European societies were relatively wealthy, and certainly after the Black Death, when wages went up and people could afford to have some luxuries that earlier they couldn't. But in many subsistence societies where they don't have a lot of food to go around, you really can't afford to waste that nutritional value making alcohol, and brewing beer, you lose some of that nutritional value. It's not just that I mean, it's called the liquid bread, but it's a pretty expensive bread when you're just sort of on the brink of subsistence. And so in those societies, they tended to have they would brew beer for special occasions, and it might be a harvest festival, it might be weddings or funerals or whatever it was, but it was kind of those celebrations, and for those everyday people. And so that was really, I think, one of the ways in which beer has just kind of acquired that sense. And I mean, there are attachments to sports as well that we could talk about. But I mean, just kind of sticking to the fundamentals of that question is that was kind of the occasion on which you would drink beer.
I kind of wonder, like, as as a scholar of this now, you're trying to go back in the archive, and like again, I think you've got the greatest archive I've ever heard of. And there's some really, for people who think about getting the book, there's some really cool pictures of stuff that comes out of the archive in the book. But I'm kind of, do we know, Jeffrey, like what we consider to be the first beer? Do we have a first beer, and do we know
Yeah,
where it
so
comes from?
this is kind of an interesting question because in already in the 1950s, an archaeologist had posed the question: what caused the agricultural revolution? I mean, why did humans settle down and start farming grains rather than the far more carefree life of the hunter gatherer? And so the debate was it bread or was it beer? And for a long time, there was really no evidence either way, frankly. But they figured that the technology of brewing was pretty advanced because bread, you just kind of add water and throw it and bake it, and I mean, obviously they started with flatbreads where you just take heat up a rock or coal or charcoal or whatever, just ashes essentially. Put the bread down and it bakes, or you can just make a porridge out of it. But to brew, you actually need an intermediary step of malting. And malting is basically the conversion of the starch in a grain into fermentable sugars. And that happens by using actually the plant's own sort of biological, so plants have these things called enzymes. And what they do is when they get into a favorable condition, they take the starch that they've been storing up, and the enzymes convert it to sugar so that they can grow into a new barley plant. And humans sort of recognize that this is what was happening, and learned to take that barley, to soak it in water, to essentially sprout it, and then and that sprouting of it released the sugars that, when they then ground up and added yeast, would ferment into an alcoholic beverage. And so anyway, so it's a pretty complicated process, and people figured that really was beyond the technological means of these primitive hunter gatherers, until about 5 years or so ago, a Stanford archaeologist named Li Liu actually discovered a 13,000-year-old brewery that they were already malting and brewing beer 13,000 years ago before the agricultural revolution. Now, mind you, that didn't actually settle the debate because at the same time, another archaeologist working in the similar area there in the Middle East discovered a bakery that was even older. But to my mind, what this really shows is just how inventive humans have been about, getting the foods that they want. And, alcohol has many properties that lend themselves, that they reduce inhibitions and, just create a jolly sociability. That's why they're, a social beverage. Plus, there's also something about a mind-altering substance. Right. I mean, you get drunk and then you see the universe in a different way. And this becomes a kind of a cosmological sort of phenomenon that shamans and other religious types. And, to this day, there's still a religious dimension, right? I mean, the Eucharist, right? It's the blood of Christ is wine. So we can see similar kinds of offerings and sacrifices in societies around the world, and so I think there really is something to that alcohol that's not just it's not just there as nutrition. It's that there's all of these social and even religious dimensions to it.
So I'm wondering. I remember my first taste of beer was god awful, and I remember when I gave my son his first taste of beer, he was like, "This is terrible." I was like, "Yes, it is. You don't ever need to drink this." Do we have a sense, Jeffrey, then of how it tasted early on? Do we have records?
We do have a sense, and partly that is because brewers have been trying to recreate ancient. There's this cottage industry of recreating ancient beers. And it started with kind of a combination, a joint venture between the archaeologist Solomon Katz and Fritz Maytag of the Anchorstein Brewery in San Francisco. And they took what is called the Hymn to Ninkasi. It's a beer poem from 4,000 years ago in Babylonia, which people have interpreted as being a recipe for beer, and so they decided to brew up this ancient Babylonian beer, and actually that has been followed on by both advances in science, which tell us a lot more about what was being used. Because now, of course, these archaeologists can take, samples, scrape samples out of the insides of mugs or pitchers or amphora or you name it, and they do spectrometry to see actually what the components of them were. And Patrick McGovern is one of the leading scholars, or was one of the leading scholars. He passed away recently. And he, in turn, has teamed up with one of the innovative brewers of the modern world today, Sam Calagione of Dogfish Head Brewery in Delaware. And they've got like a whole line of ancient beers and really from around the world because McGovern, did all this kind of globe hopping research, and whenever they dug up some ancient thing, he was like, "Have you got any jugs I can sample?" And he was the kind of guy who would actually sample it, Oh, there's liquid in the bottom of that? Hand it over.
God bless him. God bless him.
Anyway,
for that.
but that doesn't really fundamentally answer the question of what did it taste like. And so a couple of things that I'm pretty confident that these alcoholic beverages tasted like. So first of all, they were flat. Okay, because you need to have airtight containers for that fermentation, which it transforms sugars into alcohol, but then carbon dioxide, right? And it's the carbon dioxide when it's trapped that causes, it conditions your alcoholic beverage and makes it, makes it fizzy. And of course, the fizz would have long ago disappeared. The second thing that these ancient beers were probably sour. And the reason for that is, without refrigeration, that fermentation is a very fast moving thing once it gets going. And, the end product is vinegar, and so you got to catch it at just the right moment for it to be sweet. And they seem to have been very, that sweetness, as far as just kind of a cross-cultural survey and, just kind of, and these are all translations anyway, but that sweetness was one of the most common, sort of desirable traits, when they praise a beer, sweet was one of the things that they were praising. Strong was the other, but, another thing that these ancient beers would have been is, shall we say, textured. They didn't have filters, and so there would be floaters in there.
Okay.
And so actually a lot of drinking really from a wide range of places, they would drink out of a straw. So they'd stick this, some kind of a reed or something down under, because they'd be on the top, right? Whatever organic matter would be floating there on the top, and then they would drink it out of the bottom. And so there was that. So those are some of the things that, and obviously they would use whatever ingredients they had and probably mixtures. There certainly was no, beer purity law back then that you had to use. People would use whatever they had.
Sounds like Cajuns making gumbo. They just throw whatever into a pot and call it good.
Oh, yeah.
All right. I want to be really good technical historians, Jeffrey, and just fast forward a few thousand years as we want, because so much of this book is actually devoted really around Pilsner and lager and things like that. I should tell you now, I had an awakening. In 2022, I got to go to Prague. It was a place I'd always longed to go. You remember the NXS video back in the 80s for Never Tear Us Apart, and then they're walking along the bridge. I wanted to go. I remembered this from my childhood. For those of you listening, the 80s were a wonderful time, unless you count the Reagan years. Anyway, but I go to Prague, and I fall deeply, helplessly in love. My son says I talk about it like a former girlfriend. It is just this magical city, and I'm drinking beer first thing in the morning. It's just amazing. Can we talk about Bohemia and really the rise of Pilsner and why this takes a turn? How does this lager, can we talk about the difference between maybe Pilsner and lager, where this comes from, and maybe the subtleties between the two, and why these are so important to today?
Okay, I will do that. But before I do, actually, as long as we're going to have Prague reminiscences.
Oh, please.
So
absolutely.
I actually went there in February of 2020 and just got out before the world shut down.
Yeah, sure.
And so that added a particular something to there. And the thing about so the Czechs are renowned, along with the Belgians, as being like the two biggest beer cultures in the world. And the Irish and the Brits and the Germans and others, kind of, they're up there. But if you really want beer, you go to Belgium, go to the Czech Republic, because that's where it's the real culture is, and they take it very seriously. And what I was really struck by was not the classic Pilsner or what have you, but by just how craft brewing has become so central to Czech beer culture. And it totally makes sense that they would pick right up on that, and celebrate it. But anyway, but getting back now to the 19th century and lager. So I should say that the history of lager beer is made with a different kind of yeast than all other beers. And the classic brewing yeast, Saccharomyces cerevisiae, what is it? The sugar eating yeast is the same thing that they use to make wine and bread and all of this stuff. And it ferments best at around, kind of room temperature, call it, 28 Celsius, sorry, call it, somewhere in around 68 degrees. If it gets too hot, it runs out of control and bad things happen. If it gets too cold, it just goes dormant and shuts down. But there's a particular kind of yeast that is a hybrid between Saccharomyces cerevisiae and a Tibetan high mountain cold hardy yeast called Saccharomyces eubanis or something like that. And it's this yeast is actually dubbed Pastorianus, right after Pasteur. But it's a cold hardy yeast that will ferment. It's kind of slow. If you have in a warm temperature, if you've got your brewing liquor, basically a sugar solution, and you throw in two different kinds of yeast, one just regular brewing yeast, and one is this lager yeast or the regular yeast is just going to run circles around it and outcompete it, and you're gonna have regular beer. But if it's cold weather, say like a Bavarian winter, the Saccharomyces cerevisiae, the regular brewing beer is just going to fall asleep, and then the lager yeast is going to take over. And this yeast actually is kind of widespread around Europe, and it was first discovered, presumably, or it seems, or our earliest knowledge of it is from the Middle Ages, and it was Bohemian brewers who actually introduced it to Bavaria. And it also appeared in various places really around Germany and in even in the Low Countries, that sometimes it would pop up. But it was in Bavaria where brewers really learned to do that. And the reason for it was that they had that regulation against brewing in the summertime. And I mean, there are kind of hygienic reasons for doing that. I mean, beer can get out of control and have, I mean, it won't hurt you. It's just bad beer. But the real reason that the regulation was enacted was because you couldn't brew barley beer, which is what your everyday beer was, but you could brew a wheat beer, the Hefeweizen. And it just so happened that was a monopoly of the Duke. And so, if you wanted a beer in the summertime, you had to pay extra for the Duke's beer. And the Hofbrauhaus was actually originally his old brewery, and then people would go in there, and that's what you could drink during the summer. But the Bavarian brewers were smarter than that. And what they did was that they would, over the winter, when it was legal to brew beer, they would brew beer, and then they would stash it away in caves and caverns in warehouses, packed in ice. And these caverns in German are called Lager, right? And then in the summer months, and it would just ferment happily away at very slowly, very cold temperatures, and make this wonderful, clean, crisp. And it was very clean because, of course, nothing else was happening down in that beer, right? No contaminants, no bacteria or wild yeast or anything could take off because it was, it's already, it's far too cold for that. And then by the time, the kind of the yeast is done, the alcohol level is just too strong for anybody to live in there, except the drinker. And so it was clean, but it also had a unique property that when it finished fermenting, it would sink to the bottom of the vat. And so, you could just pour off the stuff on the tap and it would be particularly clean and pure. And so this Bavarian beer that would be then fermented over the winter and then served up ice cold in the summer became enormous. I mean, it was like the celebrated around Europe. That people would like import this Bavarian beer from far away for celebrations. It was kind of a this wonderful beer. And that's where things stood in the up till about the 18th century. It was already well known, and the brewers had actually started to develop these big caverns under the city for chilling it, and then they'd have like in the gardens above. That was where they'd have the beer gardens where they would serve the beer, and so it was this whole scene. And anyway, so that's where we're at in the early 19th century. So a well-known beer, but still a local beer. I mean, they would ship it to, but in carts, it takes a long time, and even lager beer, would eventually go bad, and so you kind of have a sell-by date on it. But then you have industrialization. And so you have new brewing techniques which were invented in Britain to supply a mass population of the urban working classes. And so they developed temperature control and new forms of malting and all the rest to mass produce beer. But then when they take those technologies into Bavaria in the 1830s or so, that's when that industrial lager takes off. And this happens right at the same time that the railroads are starting to arrive in places like Munich. And so this lager beer gets shipped around, Central Europe anyway. It's enormous. I mean, it's like, it was the difference between night and day. Suddenly there was this new beer. It was clean. It was crisp. It was wonderful. But of course, and this is the thing, right? Whenever you have this new product, right, people are going to want to get in and make their own versions of it. And so there was this enormous competition. And these new lager breweries were really opening across Europe, but in three places in particular. Vienna, the capital of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, but then also in Bohemia, which kind of had always had this beer drinking tradition. And in particular in the town of Pilsen. And, we think of Pilsen now as this brewing town, but it was actually a mining town at the time, right? Kind of this grubby, but they had the money from the mines. And so they built a new brewery. It opened up in 1842. They hired a Bavarian brewer to bring that lager brewing technology skill for the Citizens Brewery, and it became a hit, and everybody loved it. And one of the distinctive things about it was actually the color of the beer. And here's where we can really see, kind of the way that this is being driven not by local traditions but by capitalism. Because what happened was that each town developed its own signature lager. And so in Bavaria, they made a dark beer, right? And to this day, if you ask for a Munich lager, you'll get a dark beer. Although even in Munich, I mean, the most popular beers are the Helles, right? The golden lager. And it has been for 100 years now. And that's part of the story too. But the signature lager is the dark one. And these are all being made by this British flue kiln malting things where they toast the malt with indirect heat. It's actually built, taken out of the same technology they used for coffee roasting. And in Vienna, they took actually the same pale ale malt, so kind of an amber color that these ales were in Britain, and used that for the Vienna lager. But it was the Pilsner lager that was the golden lager, that where they use the lightest possible malt, and that golden lager is the one that really takes off, and it takes a while because Pilsen actually is not connected to the railroad system until about 1860. And so they're not really exporting much beer. It's all being consumed locally. Although already, in the 1840s and 1850s, it's spreading around the area. And so places like Prague and Budweiser, all of these others are doing the same kind of pale golden lager. And it becomes kind of a regional tradition, that each of these regions, even though they're coming out of a particular town, it spreads locally and then becomes kind of a regional thing. And so, although we call it Pilsner now, it was actually widespread really throughout Bohemia in the mid 19th century.
One of the things that I think is fascinating about the book is, and you point this out, it's like we tend to think of beer as a super localized thing, right? This beer comes from Munich, or it comes from St. Louis, or it comes from this place. As you're pointing out, like, you've got the technology coming out of England, going on these rails, you've got people quite literally importing other people to come in and make these beers, and then they get these things. And then one of the things that I hadn't really conceptualized, I guess maybe I'd kind of thought about it and hadn't really, you kind of spelled it out for me, this idea of the difference between like appellations and wine, because we don't really think of Pilsner as tied to like this particular, because you can get a Pilsner from anywhere, whereas you get a Bordeaux, it's coming from a very specific part of France, right? So I think it's kind of fascinating. It's just like, now you've just got a Pilsner that could mean a beer from almost anywhere, just brewed in a certain kind of style, right?
Well, and that really is the result of a lot of kind of a confluence of multiple things. So in France, winemakers in places like Champagne, in Bordeaux, in Burgundy, they're making a lot of money. And I mean, they're a major industry that is really central to, right, kind of the French conception of their own civilization. And so they are able to press very quickly that no one else can use their names, right? That already in the 1850s, right, that individual estates, chateaux, that they owned that name. And likewise, that a sparkling wine to be called champagne had to be from the actual district of Champagne. Okay, and this becomes codified in law, and I mean, the champagne makers and the Bordeaux, they've got like, they're lawyered up, right? They're going to make sure that because I mean, the technology for making sparkling wine is pretty well known, and so they're making it in Germany and Italy and Spain and so on. Those French are going to make sure that they aren't going to call it champagne, right? And in part because they've invested a lot in advertising, in placing those wines in the royal courts of Europe among, all the best taverns and, cabarets and whatnot. Okay. And the problem is that from the very beginning, you have people adopting that technology, those new things, and basically brewing, beers that more or less resemble a Munich lager, and then calling it Munich lager, right? And because beer is so much more diffuse, it's impossible for the brewers to like sue everybody. And they probably should have gotten started earlier. Kind of they were slow off the mark, and that's an interesting question, and somebody really should look into that. Why it took so long for them to start using the lawsuits, because by the time that they did, you had a very large brewing industry, particularly in northern Germany. That was a real motor of the economy. And I mean, Bavaria had always been the biggest brewery in Germany. and even though it had a political clout, even after after unification, but those northern brewers in places like Hamburg or Berlin, I should say, are making a ton of money. And if they are told that they can't call their beers, Pilsner or Munich for that matter, they're going to lose a lot of money. And so, it's just at the end of the day, the courts say, yeah, you can call it that. That basically, instead of being a geographical designation, that these names are styles that anybody can use. Now, admittedly, they can't say that their beer is from Munich or Pilsen if it's not, but they can say, nach bayerischer Art, in the style of Bavaria, or Pilsner Art, in the style of Pilsen. And so the name's on the thing, whereas, if you put the name of champagne, well, like that, like Miller, they had the champagne of beers, and to this day you can't sell that beer in Europe because even though nobody's going to confuse
Right.
a Miller beer with sparkling wine from Champagne, but it doesn't really matter. What would they, just by putting the name Champagne of Beers on the label, that is illegal.
All respect to the good people at the Miller Brewing Company, but I've had the beer in Europe, and I can't quite see the good folks of Prague switching to a Miller to begin with.
No.
And this brings up a funny thing to me, Jeffrey, because I'm a native Kentuckian, and I move out here to Colorado, and I show up. It's like, hey, we've got some great whiskeys out here in Colorado. We've got a terrific bourbon for you to try. And of course, I hear that, and I'm like, wait, what? No, absolutely not. You were not taking on my people. We don't have a lot in Kentucky, Jeffrey, but we've got a few things. We've got basketball, bourbon, and horse racing, and you don't get to have any of the three of them. So I'm like, you're nonsense. I won't drink your bourbon. Okay, I'll have a drink. I'll try it, and no way, and I'll be a snob. And then I had it, and it was really, really good. And I was like, "Damn it, this isn't from Kentucky, but this is this is pretty solid." Can we talk though? The vast majority of our audience is American. I've got a good friend of mine up in Vancouver. He says nobody here listens to podcasts. We'd make fun of you who are on a podcast. But I'm assuming we've got a Canadian audience too. Can we talk how beer makes its transition stateside or to North America? Like, what does this migration look like? How does beer end up here? I know you said there were some varietals or some versions of it down in what is now Mexico, but what is like this German beer? How does this come over with the immigrant wave into the plains? What happens?
Yeah, it's absolutely, German or Central European migrants, really,
Sure,
because,
sure.
there are, Swiss and Austrian and Bohemian and whatnot. But yeah, it's the German triangle, right? This is something that already in the 19th century, there was this enormous migration that was coming into the area from Milwaukee to Cincinnati to St. Louis, right? All three very big brewing towns, which isn't to say that you didn't have breweries all up and down the East Coast too. And Germans all over Brooklyn and Klein Deutschland, there in Manhattan. And there's just lots and lots of breweries all over the place. But yeah, it's that migration of Germans, and they're bringing this lager beer in particular, because you had English breweries making ale, making porter, and whatnot for a long time, but it was really taking off then. And a couple of things that really are driving it, and one and there's that all that sort of nativist sentiment in the 1840s and 50s, and there's actually a lager beer riot in Chicago when they tried to they closed down the German taverns. Right, and the other ones, were fine, but when they were targeting the Germans and their beer, that's when you had real problems. But it was actually during the Civil War when you had a lot of Germans who would, volunteer for the army, and they would drink their beer and share it with the people, in their unit or whatever. And so, and the Germans really, I think, became American in large part during the Civil War because of their service, and that beer drinking became acceptable and came to be seen, kind of as a temperance, as opposed to drinking whiskey or something, which was more a harder liquor, and one that came to be more problematic, at least for some. So that's really, I think, when lager beer kind of becomes accepted as American and really takes off. And you can just see it in the growth of beer brewing, really, and throughout, in the post Civil War era, you have breweries everywhere. I mean, even in the South, where there traditionally had been, that was whiskey country, right? But and especially once you can start, using refrigeration to brew these lager beers, it becomes kind of a national phenomenon.
You talk about a national phenomenon, and it feels like, Jeffrey, we tend to associate here in the United States beer places like Denver, right? Colorado's a big beer place. Milwaukee, Minneapolis is another great, as both of you and I know, for St. Louis, right? Anheuser-Busch becomes this huge thing. But I seem to have started to become aware in my own, was it the 1990s or so, where I start to see into the American palate, Heineken, Corona, Dos Equis with that fabulous marketing campaign, and all these other places. And it felt a bit almost like as wine became, after this, the Paris tasting in 1976, for the people who are there's this amazing thing called the Judgment in Paris. You should absolutely look it up. But it seems like Americans become aware of international beers more recently in, say, the last 30 years. Do you see that as well? What accounts for maybe the acceptance where people start to drink this stuff? Because you watch the Fast and Furious franchise, and that's what they drink. They drink the Corona, right? It's like this new symbol of America, the diversity of the country.
Well, it was a very conscious advertising campaign, and it really starts already at the end of Prohibition. I mean, Heineken sends its salespeople to the United States, and they worked very hard. First of all, to ensure that the beer had this elite character, right? And so they were putting it in the finest social clubs, in fancy restaurants, and all of these best places in New York City, trying to make sure that it was associated with high style and the elite. And they were enormously successful, and it becomes this the drink of the if you're I love that line from the the Heineken or the Dos Equis line. I don't always drink beer, but when I do, it
is a brilliant advertising campaign. They
really
just brought him back.
Did they? Okay.
They just brought him
actually
back.
The amazing thing about that, and it really kind of goes to show you what's on, that was not actually created by the Dos Equis people. That was not created by the Mexicans. That ad was created by Heineken's advertising. Heineken cut a deal with Cuauhtémoc to sell their beers outside of Mexico. And so they had the marketing thing, and they came up with the ad. And of course, the ad has nothing to do with Mexico. I mean,
it's an old Jewish guy pretending to be a Mexican.
I mean, absolutely.
Makes no sense.
No, it doesn't. But that is kind of the point, right? And you could say the same really for Corona. And Corona actually takes the sort of the low road, if you will, right? If Heineken, is the thing you drink in a fancy restaurant, and because it's got that distinctive green bottle, right, that they're drinking Heineken. It's kind of that sort of visible symbol that I am special because I'm drinking my beer out of a green bottle.
Is this the line of beer? Is that how they're positioning themselves?
That's certainly they worked very hard to try to create that image. Okay. No, actually, the wine of beer is, of course, Belgian, but we'll get back to that later.
Go back to Blue Moon. Yeah, go ahead.
And then, though, Corona sort of takes the low road. And a Corona is actually sold out of these clear glass long necks and has been since it was founded in the 1920s in Mexico. And it was in Mexico considered to be the bricklayer's beer. The totally working class. Nobody would be seen drinking this stuff. And in about, I want to say 1979 or so, the Modelo brewery who makes Corona, what the hell? Let's ship some of it up there, and it didn't catch on. It was just like completely flopped. But part of the problem is that they knew Americans drink beer out of brown bottles, and so they put it in a brown bottle, and people get this thing, and it's a shitty beer. Pardon me, and it just nothing happens. So about 4 years later, a new guy takes over the advertising, and he said, "Well, let's just, over the export part of the business," and says, "Well, let's just ship it as is, and just see what happens." It exploded. It took off. It was astonishing. To this day, business schools teach the Corona story as like this marketing phenomenon, and the amazing thing was they weren't even marketing it. There was no advertising campaign. It was strictly word of mouth. And because there wasn't very much of it to begin with, it ran out. And then you had like this whole Corona, drought. And people were like buying up bootleg Coronas. And it's amazing. And in fact, there was even it took off so fast that there was even, and this was I don't remember the name of the guy, but it was the distributor in Denver was actually shipping beer illegally because you can, the very arcane, distribution laws for alcohol in the United States, and you'll only have a license for where you have a license. And so he was trans-shipping it to the East Coast because he knew he could make more money off of it selling it in like New York City, right? Because they didn't have any Corona at all. And so you had these like shortages, and people were like, it was a black market. People would pay double the cost, to get this Corona beer because it was so cool.
I'm thinking now, and I have to tell you quickly. I remember the first place I had a Heineken, Jeffrey, you're going to laugh. It was in Puerto Rico. I'm 21 years old. I'm visiting my girlfriend down there. Her dad's like, I drink this. And I remember having it, and I was like, this is god awful. I could drink Heineken now, but at the time, oh my gosh. I have to ask you though, because I do want to come back to this because, I don't want to leave this alone. I remember in the 80s, there was really this push for Bud or Bud Light. And really like and I'm hoping maybe you can spell this out, the idea of the sexualization, because we tend to think of beer as a masculine kind of drink, although plenty of women drink beer as well. But how companies got men to drink this lighter calorie lager because it was considered a bit feminine initially.
Yeah. So actually, this was invented by one of the great brewing scientists of the 20th century, Joseph Awades, and found a way to heighten the enzymes so that, he was basically just ferment more of the starch out of the beer so that there would be less residual sugar, and so it would be a lower calorie one. And they did sell it as kind of a diet beer. Sell it, I should say. They tried to market it as a diet beer. It went nowhere. Now, this was a time of consolidation within the industry, and lots of beer breweries were going out of business. And it went through like about 3 different companies before it was finally picked up by the good people at Miller. Now, Miller had been a family business up through about the 1950s. I don't remember exactly when they were bought up by Philip Morris, the tobacco company.
Just sinful.
Yes. And the thing about tobacco is they know advertising, right? Because first of all, they're selling a product that kills people. Second of all, they're selling a product that is completely indistinguishable, one, cigarette from the other. right? And so if they're gonna, win customers, they have to, have really good madmen, advertising agents, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so when they got beer, they realized that they got this brewing company. They realized that this was the same thing, essentially, right? And already, pale lager had gotten so bland that advertising executives already in the 1960s, they would do focus groups, and they would, people would say, "Oh, my beer is the best beer. This is my beer, and I wouldn't drink any other beer." But in blind taste tests, they couldn't pick their beer out of lineup of others. So it was really about creating a brand identity, right? Sort of advertising these things. And that's really what it's oligopolistic competition. Instead of underselling, you're trying to do a price war and putting everybody out of business. They use advertising and other kinds of ways of selling beer. And actually, advertising was virtually nothing. And now there's more money spent on advertising than actually on brewing. That's where those big companies, spend their money, is, all those massive advertisements. Think of the Super Bowl. Every year in the Super Bowl, they would have some, Budweiser ad or whatever. But especially in that period in the 70s and 80s, the Miller or Philip Morris, really, people, they were geniuses. And so they got this diet beer, and they said, wait a minute, we're never going to be able to sell that. And so rather than trying to sell a diet beer, it was basically an opportunity to drink more, right? Less filling, great taste. That was the ad that launched the whole light beer sector. Right? It was really one of the original examples of supersizing the American diet.
I have to ask you, though, we talk about these powerhouses of American economy. When you talk about Philip Morris, we're talking about Budweiser and Anheuser-Busch and Coors and Miller and all these things. And I'm thinking about trying to, how, and they're all established. You talk about these companies have legacies that date into the hundreds of years. And I'm wondering, though, it seems to me, and maybe I'm wrong, with this craft brewery explosion, because you and I both lived in Minneapolis. You're talking about Town Hall Brewery, a place I know well because I also spent time in the history department at the University of Minnesota. God bless them over there. They drove us all right into the brewery. You live in a great town in Toronto. Obviously, I'm here in Colorado, which has a huge, but it seems like every city now, Jeffrey, in the U.S. at least, has its own microbrewery. And I'm kind of wondering, does this come from like that Sam Adams point? Because I see like this. How do we explain now the explosion of every town has its own brewery? It feels like what happens here?
Well, there's a couple of models there, and I guess I would go more with Fritz Maytag and Anchor Steam, though.
Really? Okay.
So out of San Francisco, and San Francisco really is kind of ground zero for craft brewing in the United States. There's lots of places where they do it, really up and down the West Coast. Vermont's another very early place, but the and when Maytag, who comes from the Maytag family, right, the washer dryer people. And so he has this fortune. He takes over this company, and he realizes, he knows nothing about brewing. He just likes beer. Is that he educates himself, learns to brew, and goes to Europe and sees that Europeans still have beers that have body, that have taste, that haven't been, kind of made completely tasteless and bland. By the industry, and this is not, to my mind, a nefarious plot by these giant brewing companies to sell piss. It's what American consumers wanted, and we can talk about why that is in the context of the processed food industry, where soft drinks and purity are the ideals. But anyway, so the American beers mass market beers. And of course, Coors is the biggest one of all. I mean, it's just water. And so, for people who want taste, and by taste, I mean both actual body and flavor in their beer, but also want social distinction, of not drinking the same beer everybody else has. That's what the craft brewery industry was doing. And in the early days, before there was a craft brewing industry, Maytag and Anchor Steam were taking on the import market. I mean, their target was not Budweiser, it was Heineken that they were trying to compete with, right? And it was a small segment of the market, but, a potentially very profitable one, as Heineken certainly discovered. And so that's really where it starts. But there's more to it than that. And certainly in the United Kingdom, where actually home brewing and craft beer takes off before it does in the United States, the CAMRA, as it's called, the Campaign for Real Ale, is as much about restoring the pub as a community center as it is about the quality of the ale. And it's a real estate business as much as a brewing business. And trying to preserve that communalism. And that is a lot of what craft breweries sell. It's as much about a place for people to gather after work and drink beer, as it is about a highfalutin, sort of. I mean, you can buy, no doubt, highfalutin beers and all, but it becomes a place where just another, pub, tavern, bar.
I guess, I'm thinking now about this. Do you remember the film Cocktail comes out in the late 80s with Tom Cruise? Do you remember he gets laughed out of business school because he's got the idea of of bringing back that local pub, and the guy's like, "You're crazy." And I almost feel like that's an awful film, Jeffrey, but it feels like he was ahead of his time. I want to ask you a few kind of quick questions here as we kind of go along here. So maybe some fun things to kind of throw at you here. If you could time travel and have a beer in any historical setting, where do you go and what are you drinking?
Wow, now that's an interesting thought. And so, I mean, and here's where it's hard to separate the drink from the social milieu, right? So do I go to Vienna in 1900 and just being in Vienna and drinking a beer with Freud or with Wittgenstein or whatever, right? So am I looking for people to drink beer with, and then just whatever kind of beer is available then, or am I looking at kind of revolutionary moments? I mean, do I want to go back to the town of Pilsen? On October 17 or whenever it was, they cracked that first keg of I guess it'd probably be November when they finally opened it. They brewed it on, I think it was October 5th, 1842, the very first Pilsner beer. And then I think it was about November when they finally opened it up. And do I want to, drink that first Pilsner beer? And it would really be as much just to sort of see what was the original Pilsner beer, and so that would be kind of a historical research moment. Or do I want to drink with somebody who was really, so there are some real interesting characters in the beer world. And one of them, actually quite recent, was a guy called Michael Jackson, the other Michael Jackson. He always introduced himself. And he became wildly popular. Well, not as wildly popular as Michael, but as the beer hunter. And he would travel around the world drinking beer. And he was really the first beer journalist, and really defined the whole, lifestyle journalism around beer. and just to have a beer with him, and I mean, he only died about 20 years ago now, so not so very long ago. But I mean, he would, I'm sure, be a really interesting guy to drink beer with. And I mean, there are still lots of people around who did drink beer with him, or whiskey. He was actually also a big whiskey connoisseur. Or I mean, there's lots of ways to answer that question, and I guess those are some of the ways that I would, sort of. There's lots of beer to be had, and I mean, kind of as a historian who's I'm a world historian. I mean, I started as a Mexicanist, but now after teaching world history for a very long time and then doing research in world history, I've kind of broadened my horizons, if you will.
I think you make some good points, because the part of the romanticist in me says, "Oh, I want to go back to the 1920s in Paris and hang out with Hemingway and drink beer." But I think I'm 48 now, Jeffrey. I feel like I'd find him insufferable in 1922.
Oh my God, yeah. Well, I'm sure he was. Yeah, and
I don't want to hang out with those guys that age. And then part of me says, I never got to, my father passed before I could ever have that beer with my dad, right? So it's like that would be a thing. So I'm just going to say now, I've never been to Munich. I just want to go to Oktoberfest.
And Munich is a great place. I would not go to Oktoberfest. I would just go to Munich.
Okay.
And because I mean, well, and so first of all, even the locals don't like Oktoberfest anymore. It's been so commercialized and overrun. And I mean, there's been and for quite some time, there's complaints all over the world about, over tourism. And the only thing worse is like losing those tourist dollars. But anyway, that's Oktoberfest is one of those places where tourists or where locals are just kind of pissed off.
Well, then I'll fast forward in time 3 years until my son turns 21. We can have our first official beer together. All right, let me get you in trouble here. Best beer city in the United States and best beer city in the world. What do you got?
Wow. Yeah. Okay. That's going to be that's going to get me in trouble for sure.
Yes, sir. That's why I waited till last. So you're already hooked into this podcast.
Yeah. So, oh man, I mean, there are just so many. I mean, and I mean, I've done research for this book, but I'm actually not like. I mean, there are people who are like way beerier than I am.
Sure.
And so, I mean, I've had really good beers in a lot of places. And I can't even pretend to know, like where the hottest new beer place is. But you know what, I'm just going to tell you, because the place I've had the most good beer, it just happens because I've spent the most time there, is Chicago, which is kind of my hometown.
Great town.
And there's Chicago. a lot of really good beer. And I mean, it's actually always been kind of, neglected. It's not Milwaukee, and it's not Cincinnati or St. Louis. And the reason those cities became sort of big export markets or big beer exporters was because they weren't Chicago, right? Chicago was a big enough city that you could make big breweries. And the same was true for New York as well. I mean, the biggest brewery in the United States was this Earhart Brewery, German guy. It was actually in Hell's Kitchen. And, there's so many Germans in New York that he could be the biggest brewery in the country for a time, just selling to the local market, right? And it's same for Chicago, is that there was just so. But then there's a lot of really good beer. And actually, so you'll like this. So there's this kind of, I don't want to say, well, anyway, so it's kind of a bourbon barrel brewed beer kind of scene in where they take the old barrels out of Kentucky and ship them up to Chicago, and they brew, stouts and other, big beers in them. And it just, that's some really good drinking. So.
Yeah, I like.
So that would be Chicago.
Chicago's yes.
And you can the Portlands and the all the Denvers and all
both
the
Portlands,
rest.
Right?
Just they can just run me down and say I don't know what I'm talking about, but by God, I'm going to stick with my guns there. And then the best beer town in the world. Who? I'm not gonna. It's not Munich, frankly. And even in Munich, the locals there kind of turn up their nose at a lot of the, not just Lowenbrau, but a lot of the breweries so it's not Munich, but it might be Prague.
I am desperate to go back to Prague. And for people who haven't been, it's the beer, the alcohol content. Correct me if I'm wrong here. It's a little lower. It feels like I could just get up and have a beer. Say my first beer I would have at like 10 a.m. and I would walk around the city, and then I would go to the next place and have a beer, and then it just kind of slowly all day. It felt so fresh. Maybe it's just because I love that city so much.
Yeah, it's a wonderful city.
It's if people haven't been, and you keep talking about this other city here that I need to give a shout out for, because I am a proselytizer. I don't know what I am for Cincinnati. People have never been to Cincinnati. They are missing out. It is a terrific town. And I'd actually, first time I went was actually like 2021, and I was like, what is this place? I had no idea. And I'm from Kentucky. It was amazing.
Across the border.
It's part of the triangle, the Lexington, Louisville, Cincinnati, I may have asked this earlier. I may have answered this myself, but which historical figure would have been absolutely insufferable at a craft brewery?
Wow. I gotta say, and it's not quite a historical character, but maybe you'll appreciate it anyway. Hamlet.
Oh.
Faced with that line of taps, he would not be able to manage.
All right. Best beer movie, because I almost asked you to do a film on this, so I decided just to do a straight one on the book.
Best beer movie.
Mm-hmm.
Wow. Can I do a TV show?
You may.
Okay. Great White North.
What is this?
Okay, so this is these two Canadian comedians that played these brothers who. It's
Bob and Doug. Was it?
Yeah,
Rick Moranis and they made Strange Brew. They made the film.
Yeah. Okay. Well, so they did make a movie after all.
Yeah.
I've never actually seen the movie, but they're just these Canadian, and it's the stupidest thing. But when you're a university student and there's just something deeply funny about it. That
oh my gosh, yes.
And in a way that somehow for me resonated more than classics like Animal House.
Most overrated beer style.
IPA.
Thank you. And there's another word we've been saying throughout this episode, which is piss. And I think that's exactly what IPA tastes like.
Well, and so the thing about IPA, is that it becomes, this sort of one-dimensional, right? It's like, how bitter can we make a beer? And so one of the revered IPA, Imperial, oop-de-doop IPAs, Pliny the Elder. There's this whole world of beer reviews out there. Mm. And one of the reviewers said, this beer was made to try to hurt your mouth.
Okay. I like to joke that I'm not a native Coloradan because I don't drink IPA. I don't have a mustache and I don't have a calf tattoo. So, there are the things that they have out here. What's your most underrated beer, Jeffrey?
Underrated beer. I want to say a pale lager.
I like it. Give me this. What is one beer every American or Canadian needs to try before they die?
Actually, you know what? I think it would be one of those beers that they brew with Brett. And so Brettanomyces is this wild yeast that used to be, everywhere in beer. And it's actually, you can find it in wine too. The clinical wine or beer tasters profile, the word they use to describe it is barnyard. Mm-hmm. So you can imagine, kind of what sort of flavors, notes we're evoking here. But the first time they premiered it at the Great American Beer Festival. Somebody brewed a Brett and brought it there, and people were kind of going by and tasting all the beers. Apparently, the volunteers who were pouring the beers brought over a garbage can because everybody was like spewing it out after they had tasted it. And so I think everybody should have that experience of tasting Barnyard and then spewing it, just because it would be funny.
It sounds like the things the Norwegians do with the that fish that they put in lye. It's just the nasty.
Oh yeah, lutefisk.
Lutefisk.
Absolutely.
Thank you. I was trying to. Oh my gosh, and we saw plenty of that in our time in Minnesota, I'm sure. There are so many times when I'm doing these pods and we're talking about a book, and on my end, the thing I'm trying not to do is reveal the entirety of the book. And as I'm talking to you, and I know that there's, after having finished the book, there's so much here we have not even begun to scratch in this book, which is really, really cool. But I'm kind of wondering if maybe we can talk, just maybe sum up this idea. It's like you spent all this time talking about the origins of beer, the transformations over time, its migrations, who's making it, who's drinking it, and what they're doing while they're doing both of those things. Is there one thing, Jeffrey, that kind of comes at you like that beer can tell you about like humanity itself?
Yeah, I mean, I think Marx said that religion was the opiate of the masses, but in some ways, maybe it was beer, right? That we're kind of sucked into this world of commodities, and after a hard day in the factory, an ice cold one really kind of does make you feel better. And yet, this whole, I don't want to use, kind of that language of, commodity fetishism and these other kinds of terms. But, for people who are, sort of alienated from the world that, because, you can buy stuff, but it's never, that whole consumerist lifestyle is like a treadmill. We're on a treadmill. We just kind of keep trying to put meaning in our life by buying more and more stuff. And I kind of see, those kind of craft breweries, with the mile long line of taps, and the ways that people, kind of vest their identity, and kind of knowing that distinctive beer and drinking something different from everybody else. And what I guess I would really like to emphasize is beer as sociability, right? That there's something to be said for the shared pitcher, right? And you're sitting around and you're all drinking the same thing, and it's just there's something human there, and we're living in this world where robots and machines are taking over, and if we can find some shred of humanity left. And it seems to me that one of the places to look for it, is in the tavern or the brew pub or whatever it is, but just, kind of emphasizing that human element of it.
I love it. You've been working on this project for several years now. It's now available to the masses, not unlike a beer. What comes next for you? What's in your future?
So actually, I'm teaching a class, and in fact, today was the first day of class.
Oh goodness!
And I'm teaching a class called Baking, Science, and Culture. And so our food studies program, we have a kitchen, we have an oven, and we bake. And so actually, the step from beer to bread is not all that far in some ways. And I'm still kind of too early in the research to know exactly what shape it's going to take, other than just eating a whole lot of bread. But I'm really having enormous fun baking and sharing what I bake, and sharing this love of baking with students. And we made bao today in class, so we're going to do different kind of cultural traditions. So bao, Indian flatbreads next week. We're going to make a Roman bread the week after that. And then we're going to get into pastry, and we're going to make some rhubarb pie. The rhubarb's already popping up. So yeah, I think that
listen, I'm going to beg you for pictures. My girlfriend is Punjabi, so I'm going to beg you for pictures of the. I am learning the cuisine as fast as I can. It's a horrible way of trying to impress the entire family and stuff. So I'm desperate to see how that comes out. That sounds fun.
Okay, so we have a tandoor.
Can I enroll at the University of Toronto? Am I too old? Can I start? This sounds like fun. Jeffrey, this has been an amazing conversation. I love when I essentially stop throwing away the questions I've got in front of me and we just go. This was a blast, man. Thank you so much. The book was amazing. And as fun as the book was, it just doesn't even compare to talking to you today. This was a real delight for me. So, man, thank you so much for coming in today. This was a lot of fun for me.
It's my pleasure. Great questions, and thanks for having me.
And that's a wrap here at Reckoning with Jason Herbert. Thank you so very much to our guest, Jeffrey Pilcher. If you want, you can check out his new book, Hopped Up: How Travel, Trade, and Taste Made Beer a Global Commodity, wherever you find books. Thank you, of course, to our producer, Fletcher Powell, for making this show run. And thank you to all of you guys for continuing to show up, show out, and share this show. If you like what we're doing here, make sure that you are sharing this on social media. Make sure that you have liked and subscribed. Make sure you leave us a review on Apple, Spotify, or anywhere else you listen to your pods. We've got so much stuff coming for you this summer. It's crazy. So stick around. We'll see you later. Bye.